June 30th, 1908. A fireball tears across the Siberian sky at 40,000 miles per hour. Witnesses 60 miles away are knocked from their feet by a shockwave moving faster than sound. 2,000 square kilometers of ancient forest, 80 million trees, are flattened in an instant, their trunks pointing outward like the spokes of a wheel from some invisible, impossible hub. The explosion is 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. And when investigators finally reach the site, more than a decade later, they find something that will haunt science for over a century. No crater, no meteorite, no explanation. To understand why this matters, why it matters now, today, in a way that should concern every person alive on this planet, we must first understand the world into which this event arrived. In the early 20th century, Siberia was not simply remote, it was another world entirely. The Trans-Siberian Railway, begun in 1891, had only recently stitched the eastern reaches of the Russian Empire to its western heart, and even then, the line ran hundreds of miles south of the Podkamennaya Tunguska River. The region above that river was trackless taiga, vast, ancient boreal forest stretching to the horizon in every direction, broken only by swamp and frozen river. The people who lived closest to the event were the Evenki, an indigenous reindeer-herding people whose ancestors had occupied these lands for millennia. Their nearest trading post was Vanavara, a tiny settlement that sat roughly 40 miles southeast of what would become the epicenter. The Russian Empire was in a state of considerable turbulence in 1908. Tsar Nicholas II sat on a throne that was slowly being undermined by revolution, industrial unrest, and the humiliating memory of defeat in the Russo-Japanese War just 3 years earlier. Science, meanwhile, was in a golden age of transformation. Einstein had published his special theory of relativity only 3 years before. The atom had not yet been split. The telescope had not yet reached beyond our galaxy. The universe, in other words, was still largely a mystery, and its capacity for violence was almost entirely unappreciated. Into this world, something arrived from the void between the stars, something that left no calling card, something that, had it arrived 4 hours and 47 minutes later, would not have struck an empty Siberian forest. It would have struck St. Petersburg. The first eyewitness accounts came from the Evenki. A man named Chuchin of the Shaniagia tribe later described sitting on his porch when the sky split open. He said the ground shook, a hot wind struck him, and a great light blinded him so completely he thought the end of the world had come. His brother Chekaran, who was sleeping inside their tent, was thrown into the air along with his bedding. The tent poles snapped, the forest around them ignited. At the Vanavara trading post, a man named Semyon Semyonov was sitting on his porch just after 7 in the morning when he saw the sky to the northwest split in two with a blinding flash. The heat was so intense he felt his shirt was on fire. The shockwave that followed threw him several feet from his porch and knocked out the windows of buildings around him. He later said the blast seemed to come not just from the sky, but from every direction at once. Seismographs across Russia and Europe registered the event. Barometric pressure fluctuations from the shockwave were recorded as far away as England. In the town of Kyansk, 400 miles to the south, residents reported a column of bluish light, nearly as bright as the sun, moving across the horizon before the sound reached them. A low, rolling thunder that rattled windows and cracked plaster from walls. The explosion was heard over 1 million square kilometers. Horses in villages 500 miles away were knocked from their feet. And yet, because this was Siberia, because this was 1908, because this was an empire in political crisis with no aircraft, no satellites, and no infrastructure within hundreds of miles of the site, nobody went to look. Not immediately, not for 19 years. Why did the world's largest empire fail to investigate the largest explosion in recorded human history? The answer lies in a collision of catastrophes. The Russian Empire that received the first garbled telegrams about the Tunguska event in 1908 had more immediate problems. Revolution was simmering, food shortages were chronic, the political situation was deteriorating month by month. A fallen forest in the middle of Siberia was, to the government in St. Petersburg, an abstraction, a curiosity, not a priority. A geologist named Leonid Kulik first came across witness testimony about the event in 1921, while conducting an entirely unrelated survey of meteorites for the Soviet Academy of Sciences. He read an old newspaper account describing the explosion and became immediately, obsessively convinced that a massive meteorite had struck Siberia. If he could find it, he believed, it would be the scientific discovery of the century, a mass of extraterrestrial iron large enough to supply Russia's steel industry for decades. Kulik spent 6 years fighting Soviet bureaucracy, navigating funding shortfalls, and battling sheer institutional indifference before he was finally granted an expedition in 1927. When he interviewed the Evenki who had survived the blast, he encountered something that should have warned him. They were reluctant to speak of it. Some refused outright. They called the site the Ogdi, the place of the god of fire. They believed the explosion had been a visitation from a deity, a punishment, or a warning. One elder told Kulik that the path to that place was a path to death. Kulik pressed on. On March 27, 1927, Leonid Kulik and his small team reached the edge of the blast zone on foot. What they saw stopped them in their tracks. Trees. Millions of trees. All fallen, all pointing away from a single distant point on the horizon. For miles in every direction, the ancient forest lay on its side, the trunks scorched and pale, stretching away in perfect radial formation as if God himself had exhaled across the landscape. Kulik moved forward. The ground was soft, waterlogged, treacherous. The taiga gave way to open bog, and as the team climbed higher toward the epicenter, the picture became stranger still. At the very center, where the largest crater should have been, where the greatest mass of iron should have buried itself deep into the earth, there was nothing. Trees still standing, stripped of every branch. Dead upright, like a forest of gray bones reaching toward a sky that had destroyed them. But no crater. Kulik fell to his knees. Not in prayer, in confusion. The evidence in front of him was physically impossible under every theory he had carried into that wilderness for 6 years. He looked at the standing dead trees. He looked at the fallen millions surrounding them, and slowly, the answer that he could not yet name began to form. Whatever had done this had not hit the ground. It had exploded above it. Kulik spent 3 more expeditions attempting to prove his meteorite theory, draining bogs, digging test shafts, finding nothing. He died in a German prison camp in 1942, still without an answer. The scientific consensus that eventually emerged, built over decades of analysis, points to an asteroid or comet fragment between 50 and 80 meters wide, entering Earth's atmosphere at a shallow angle and detonating approximately 5 to 10 kilometers above the surface in what is called an airburst, a phenomenon almost entirely unknown to science in 1908. The Tunguska event reshaped our understanding of cosmic risk. It became the founding case study for planetary defense science, the field now dedicated to tracking near-Earth objects and developing strategies to deflect them. In 2013, the Chelyabinsk meteor over Russia injured over 1,000 people and reminded the world that this threat did not end in 1908. The forest has regrown, the Evenki are still there, the science is still incomplete, no recovered fragment has ever definitively confirmed the object's composition. The Tunguska event remains, in the strictest sense, unsolved. An 80-meter rock, smaller than a city block, arrived without warning and erased 2,000 square kilometers of Earth. It missed every human being alive. This time. If you found this story remarkable, subscribe. We uncover forgotten history every week.